Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 9 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers. Now, whether you're playing a standard league or a full PPR league, we talk about half PPR just to meet everyone in the middle. Now, after we go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into Week 9 and which players we might want to fade based on cornerback coverage, we'll go ahead and transition into our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Of course, you can see our top 18 already on screen. But besides giving you a full visual, kind of idea as to how I have these players ranked, we're going to go through them individually as I'll share with you guys my opinions and stats that justify the reasons as to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 9. Do not forget, there are a lot of teams on bye this week. We have the Cleveland Browns, Denver Broncos, Dallas Cowboys, New York Giants, Pittsburgh Steelers, and San Francisco 49ers. With all 6 of those teams on bye, there are a lot of wide receiver talents that quite frankly aren't available for us to use. So the position will relatively get thin quickly, but hopefully we'll be able to give you guys the best possible information to make the best possible decisions to win your Week 9 matchup. And that's the entire purpose of this channel. We're trying to help you win weekly matchups and win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. So if you want daily fantasy content, be sure to subscribe down below. Help us continue to achieve our goals as we are on our way to 80,000 subscribers. Cannot thank you guys enough for the incredible support. Also, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks and you want to continue to play daily fantasy, again, you can do so by clicking the link down in the description. Travel to their website and pick more or less on a given player statistic. We talked about this earlier today in regards to the Thursday night matchup. Maybe you don't have anybody going on the Eagles and or Houston Texans. But if in fact you're trying to get a little bit of action within said contest, you can make an entry in regards to Miles Sanders. Again, we know the Houston Texans give up a lot of points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis, have given up over 1,000 rushing yards already to opposing running backs. So why not go ahead, pick more on his total rushing yards? Again, as we progress throughout today's video, we'll be talking about a couple other entries in regards to wide receiver position in terms of receiving yards or receptions via PrizePicks. You can go ahead and sign up today by clicking on the link using promo code Andrew. And when you make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right. So obviously, you guys can see on screen, we have our top 18 wide receiver rankings. Again, over the last couple days, I've asked you guys, do you guys want to see rankings like this? Obviously, I can't fit 36 players on screen unless I completely disappear, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you guys some visual representation as to what we're getting into as the video progresses for Week 9. These rankings are very much so not in a solidified position. Even though guys like Cooper Kupp, Stefon Diggs, Tyreek Hill are always going to be in that top conversation, there's a lot of injuries that we have to take into account, whether it is Cooper Kupp himself, maybe even Keenan Allen, other players that may not be at a full healthy capacity. We have to keep an eye on that. That is why rankings are subject to change, and that's why I always live stream Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning. So for those of you who are interested, especially for those of you who need rankings on Sunday morning, you can join us 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We're always live streaming with up-to-date rankings on screen to help you guys out. Free rankings to help you win your matchups. All right, so let's go ahead and transition into talking about matchups, cornerbacks, DBs, some guys that will be, of course, trying to stop our fantasy prospects from scoring, but which defenses really haven't been able to do very much in terms of stopping the opposing wide receiver position thus far this season. As you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have given up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in terms of receiving statistics alone. So receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Of course, the Atlanta Falcons are at the top of this list as their entire secondary has been torched for, I would say, the entirety of the season. But most recently, the last 3 weeks have been brutal for their secondary, whether it was DJ Moore, whether it was Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, even Brandon Ayuk, and Deebo Samuel the week before that. They cannot stop opposing wide receivers, and that is a matchup we always want to continue to exploit. Now, other teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, they are on bye, but the Kansas City Chiefs, the Baltimore Ravens, Tennessee Titans, these are teams that we absolutely want to take advantage of if, in fact, there are prospects to play in said matchups. Robert Woods isn't going to be someone that I'm interested in playing in, despite the fact that the Kansas City Chiefs have been awful in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers. But on the other end of that matchup, of course, taking on Tennessee, we have Juju Smith-Schuster, who's coming off of consecutive weeks of over 19 half PPR fantasy points, and we want to continue that momentum in said great matchup. Either way, hopefully this gives you a little bit more perspective on the matter as to what kind of statistics some of these defenses have given up. Obviously, the Denver Broncos have only given up a lone receiving touchdown to an opposing wide receiver this season. They're on a bye week, but typically you don't want to play up against, Patrick Surtain as a number 1 wide receiver in a given week, and typically we want to avoid that. But either way, We'll be referring back to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video. Typically, we do so in a star matchup designation, 1 through 5, 5 stars being the best possible matchup, 1 star being the worst. So with all that covered, let's go ahead and talk about our number 1 wide receiver going into the week. For week 9, it is Cooper Kupp. Obviously, we're starting Cooper Kupp. I don't want to, drag this on for much longer, but just to put it in perspective, Cooper Kupp in his career, when he's taken on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, these are the fantasy point totals that he has put forth since 2019. 22.4, 20.0, 26.8, and 26.1. Obviously, 2 of those matchups coming in 2021, one in the regular season and one in the playoffs, in which he recently dominated against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In fact, in the last 3 matchups against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the LA Rams have won. Sean McVay does a great job game planning against Todd Bowles' defense and going into this upcoming week with all the momentum. If Cooper Kupp is healthy, he's in our lineups and he's fired up to go ahead and drop probably 20 plus points against this secondary that hasn't been playing well as of late. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, our number 2. Stefon Diggs has probably the biggest challenge of his season. And even though it's a rookie cornerback in Sauce Gardner, the fact that according to Pro Football Focus, Sauce Gardner has only given up 147 total yards in coverage is ridiculous. He's only given up 14 receptions this year. And ultimately, it's a big test because we're talking about one of the best wide receivers in football, Stefon Diggs, who thus far this season has had 5 of his last 7 games consist of 100 plus receiving yards and a touchdown. When we're talking about potential prize pick entries, if this guy's going to go for a massive game, then we're all in on that. But if the cornerback coverage is going to play a factor, of course, that could be something that may want to slow us down, but it's not going to prevent us from starting him. I'm still expecting him to be an incredible play, but overall, I'm limiting my expectations as to how high his overall ceiling is, yet we have to automatically start him. Moving on, we're talking about Tyreek Hill, the thumbnail for today's episode. Tyreek Hill, he is on pace for legendary numbers. Right now, thus far this season, in the 8 games that they have played, he is averaging 120.13 receiving yards per game. He's only a couple yards shy of matching the average that Calvin Johnson had when he broke the record for most receiving yards in a given season. Obviously, he's going to continue to lead the league in this category as we continue, mainly because of the receptions that he is getting. The volume of receptions that Tyreek Hill has received thus far is unbelievable. He's leading the league in that category, and going forward, I don't think it's going to slow down in any sort of capacity because this entire offense is predicated on getting him the ball in open space and allowing him to get yardage after the catch. Now, unfortunately, his overall upside is capped in some capacities because he hasn't scored a touchdown since that week 2 matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. But with that all being said, he has still been able to get himself 7 or more receptions in all games but 1 this season. And the only game that he struggled was against Buffalo, which made sense. But going up against the Chicago Bears this upcoming week, where we've seen CeeDee Lamb succeed last week, I think we're in a fantastic position for Tyreek Hill to have another big week here. Moving on to Justin Jefferson, taking on the Washington Commanders defense. Justin Jefferson is in a very similar boat as Tyreek Hill. They're both great in terms of yardage. They're not scoring touchdowns. Justin Jefferson has not had a receiving touchdown since week 1 against the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, in that game, he had 2 receiving touchdowns, but since then has been relatively, empty in that category. Obviously, the fact that he's been so efficient in terms of yardage and receptions over the course of the last 4 games here, that is pretty much what's kept his fantasy value alive, but isn't getting him to that next stage at the top tier wide receiver position. In the last 4 games, he's had a minimum of 98 receiving yards in every single game. And according to Prize Picks this week, they have their current number at 90.5 receiving yards. I think this is a perfect position against an incredible matchup for Justin Jefferson to continue that streak and hopefully, for our sake in fantasy, score himself a touchdown. Moving on to DeAndre Hopkins. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, did you guys see that snag that he had against the Minnesota Vikings defense? DeAndre Hopkins looks incredible. And the fact that he had the first 6 weeks off kind of leads me to believe that those 6 weeks would have wore down his body and gotten him to a point where at this point of the season, he probably would have found an injury. And unfortunately, that is the case because of how many miles he has on his body. But now that he is being incorporated midway through the season, he is going to catch fire and absolutely dominate, especially considering how many opportunities he is receiving. In the last 2 games, he has seen 27 total targets on 73 total Kyler Murray passing attempts. That's a 36.98 target share. 37% almost target share is numbers that you never see anywhere in the National Football League. But the fact that we're witnessing that now, he's continuing to dominate against these secondaries, has the privilege of taking on a division rival in the Seattle Seahawks, hasn't taken on the Seattle Seahawks in quite some time as he missed both of those games last season due to injury. I think we're in a fantastic position to see DeAndre Hopkins have himself another big game here as the number 1 primary for the Cardinals. Moving on to A.J. Brown. Man, A.J. Brown went, nuclear to an extent. 3 receiving touchdowns, all while being double covered for the majority of that game. The fact that he's able to make these plays isn't out of the ordinary. That is A.J. Brown to a T. He's a monster wide receiver that when you give him these opportunities, he'll take advantage of it. And yes, some of the opportunities won't go his way all the time, but that's just the nature of his volatility. But we're willing to take, a 36-point week and in the following week get 4 because we understand, the entire method to the madness of what A.J. Brown presents in a fantasy value. Now, going into this week's Thursday night game, of course, I expect this to be a blowout to the capacity which maybe A.J. Brown gets himself heavily involved early, scores a bunch of touchdowns, and we're off and away. Because mainly in his career, when he used to play for the Tennessee Titans from 2019 through 2021, he put up unbelievable stats against the Houston Texans. In fact, averaging 18.38 fantasy points per game in the last 7 matchups against that defense, putting up 20.4, 21.4, 26.1, 20.3, 14.8, and 7.3. Incredible numbers across the board. A.J. Brown, if he's going to continue to garner this many targets on a weekly basis and get a lot of end zone opportunities, of course, he's going to be a fantastic option. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle at number 7. Last week, we talked about Jaylen Waddle and his prize pick number being at about 60.5. And then after I suggested it to you guys, later in the week, all of a sudden it moved to 65.5. I'm like, okay, well, it's moving a little bit. We were still okay with it. Then it moved to 68.5 by Sunday. And I was like, all right, we're moving heavily. And now it's arrived in week 9 at 70.5. I think still this is a number that is achievable, mainly because thus far this season, in the last 4 games, we have seen him put up 171, 102, 88, and 106 receiving yards with Tua when Tua is healthy and has not left the game early due to injury. That in itself speaks volumes to what kind of potential Jaylen Waddle has for the remainder of this season, especially considering with Tua throughout his entire career, he's averaging 9.2 targets per game, 6.7 receptions per game, and 0.73 receiving touchdowns per game. 16.5 half PPR fantasy points per game. Overall, if I expect Tyreek Hill to dominate against this Chicago secondary and they're going to have a tough time bottling him up, imagine what Waddle's going to do when all the attention is being pulled in one direction, when the other direction is Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson running off tackle and finding themselves a lot of success. Waddle's going to find himself open and scoring fantasy points. Moving on to Davante Adams, our number 8. Now, Davante Adams last week was sick for majority of the week, and the expectation was that he was still going to play, and we hoped that he could, find some semblance of success. But unfortunately, it wasn't a matter of just Davante Adams not having a great game. It was the entire Raiders offense that did not show up last Sunday. They didn't pass the 50-yard line once on Sunday. That is an all-time terrible performance. I don't know if that's ever existed before, but the fact that Daniel Carlson wasn't even given an opportunity to kick a field goal because they couldn't pass the logo in the middle of the field is ridiculous. Now, luckily, they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is a get-right game against an organization who has kind of fallen apart over the last couple weeks. Jerry Jeudy recently scored a touchdown against them for 63 yards. Darius Slayton scoring touchdowns. Michael Pittman going for over 130. Campbell scoring a touchdown. Alec Pierce scoring a touchdown. If anybody can score against these guys, why not? Davante Adams, Mac Hollins. Hopefully, Darren Waller's going to be healthy this week. There's a lot of success to be had here. And even though Davante Adams, 1 catch, 3 yards on Sunday, is very underwhelming, you have to take into a perspective that when I went back and watched that game, there were 2 different opportunities down the sideline where he could have had catches and very easily acted upon an additional 50-plus yards in his overall category. Now, if you get past the other side of the field, maybe you get into more of a simplified game script. Maybe you can go back to running the ball. But ultimately, it was just a game where they got shut down. They didn't even have their starters in the fourth quarter, and they kept it moving. Moving on to Mike Evans, our number 9. Mike Evans, again, as much as we talked about Cooper Kupp having a storied, successful history against the Tampa Bay defense, Mike Evans has himself a lot of success against the LA Rams most recently. In 2021 against the LA Rams, in the 2 games that they played against them, regular season and postseason, he put up 21.9 points and 14.6 points. And quite frankly, those are incredible performances. 16 targets, 8 catches, 119 yards and a touchdown. 10 targets, 8 catches, 106 yards. Now, those kind of performances look relatively similar to the kind of opportunities that Mike Evans has been receiving over the course of the last 2 weeks here, having seen 26 targets in the last 2 games. If, in fact, Tom Brady is going to continue to send the ball in his direction in a matchup where they often get boat raced by the LA Rams offense and get put into positions where they have to throw for the majority of the second half, I'm expecting Mike Evans to have himself another big week here as the number 1 for the Tampa Bay offense. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, our number 10. Listen, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a stud across the board. And we talked about it earlier today in regards to the TJ Hawkinson trade implications in fantasy football outlook for the rest of the season. With TJ Hawkinson out, there is going to be even more opportunity going in the direction to other wide receivers within this offense. Obviously not tight ends because they haven't really used Brock Wright and or Mitchell James in any sort of capacity. And quite frankly, I don't expect him to do so outside of being blocking threats. So if Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to elevate his numbers going forward, by all means, it's going to be in a perfect position. If you want to hear more details on that, you can go ahead and check out that video. I talked about how much utilization TJ Hawkinson used to see in terms of short routes ran between 0 to 9 yards, and also in terms of slot receptions. When you line up in the slot, how much opportunity was Amon-Ra St. Brown getting in comparison to Hawkinson? So check that out today. But outside of that, when we're talking about the Green Bay Packers matchup, last time Amon-Ra St. Brown had an opportunity against them, week 18 of the 2021 season. He put up 22.1 fantasy points, and he, of course, continued his streak. I'm expecting him to get back on track, see more targets, and when he does, be that much more effective going forward. And I'm hearing that DeAndre Swift didn't even practice today, which makes me think this really could be the Amon-Ra blow-up, similar to last season from weeks 13 through 18. Moving on, we have T. Higgins as our number 11. All right, so with Ja'Marr Chase probably out once again, we have T. Higgins in the conversation of being the number one for this team. And though he was relatively underwhelming against the Cleveland Browns defense, I do expect this offense as an entire whole to get back to running the ball and then open up the game via play action and keep Joe Burrow protected. They're going to address that, and that'll be perfectly fine. Jeremy Chin is going to be out for the Carolina Panthers going into this week. That opens up a lot, especially considering how talented he is at that safety position. But going up against some of these top corners of the Carolina Panthers is no joke, but I don't really think that's going to bother T. Higgins in any sort of capacity. In the last 8 games that he has played without Ja'Marr Chase, from 2020 through 2022, he has averaged 14.06 fantasy points per game with Joe Burrow. If we're going to see that combination continue, I'm expecting a lot of success from T. Higgins, similar to the way we saw last week. Yes, it was in garbage time, but I'll take garbage time touchdowns in any sort of capacity we can get in a great matchup. Moving on, we have Keenan Allen closing out our top 12 here, taking on the Atlanta Falcons. Of course, the Atlanta Falcons, they give up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. Of course, recently, DJ Moore, 6 catches, 152 and a touchdown. We had even Terrace Marshall in that game, 4 catches for 87. Tyler Boyd, 8 catches, 155 and a touchdown. Ja'Marr Chase in that same game, 8 catches, 130 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, need I say more? The fact that this defense also gave up 2 receiving touchdowns to Ayuk 3 weeks back, it just leads me to believe that Keenan Allen is in a perfect position to succeed. He just needs to be healthy. Again, when he has been healthy with Justin Herbert throughout his career, he's averaging 14.16 half PPR fantasy points per game. He's an elite wide receiver. He just needs to be on the field and ready to go for week 9. All right, moving on to number 13, we have DJ Moore. Listen, DJ Moore has had 2 consecutive weeks of over 16 fantasy points. Obviously coming off of a game against the Atlanta Falcons. Of course, we just mentioned that in regards to Keenan Allen, but it was a massive performance. Obviously, him dropping the ball late in that game, then getting another opportunity to score a touchdown and tie it up, really elevated his overall numbers, but we'll take that. Now, considering this week they take on the Cincinnati Bengals, I originally thought this was going to be a tougher matchup, but quite frankly, it's probably not going to be, mainly because the cornerbacks for this team are injured. Chidobe Awuzie, season-ending ACL. Eli Apple's been out for the last couple weeks. He's probably going to miss again. If that's going to continue to be the trend, we saw, the backup cornerbacks for the Cincinnati Bengals get torched by Amari Cooper and DPJ on Monday. Amari Cooper going for 131 receiving yards and a touchdown, while DPJ went for 81 receiving yards on 4 catches. There's a lot of potential here, and if DJ Moore is going to act upon it with PJ Walker, we're obviously starting him this upcoming week. Moving on, we have Chris Godwin as our number 14. Now, the matchups between these two teams have often been shootouts, and Chris Godwin has been another one of these benefactors when he has taken on the LA Rams since 2019. In fact, since then, he has been averaging 22.2 half PPR fantasy points per game against the LA Rams defense in the last 3 matchups he has faced against them. Now, over the course of the last 3 weeks here, weeks 6 through 8, he has seen 36 total targets coming from the direction of Tom Brady. If we're going to continue to see Chris Godwin see double-digit targets every single consecutive week, eventually those reception totals are going to increase. So will the yards, so will the touchdowns. And in a potential shootout here, I'm expecting Chris Godwin to have himself a big performance, even in a half PPR. Moving on to Chris Olave, taking on the Baltimore Ravens. Chris Olave is in a position right now where even though he's coming off of a relatively quiet week with only 7.7 fantasy points, he's still one of the primaries of that offense. And with, of course, Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas having not played in the last, 4 or 5 weeks now, I expect Chris Olave to maintain as the number 1 receiving option of this offense, even if they come back. But one of the primary things I wanted to mention in regards to Chris Olave's week 8 performance was the fact that the end score of that game was 24-0. The starting offense for the Raiders did not pass the 50-yard line in any of their attempts. So in my opinion, we're probably in a position where, yeah, in that game, you go into the second half, they're not throwing the ball much. Yes, the Camaro, they like to dump it off here and there, but outside of that, they weren't looking to throw. There's a reason why Taysom Hill had himself 9 rushing attempts. If you're going to get yourself into a very positive game script, passing the ball is not going to be in that category. But when you take on Baltimore, this should be a game script where, of course, you're going to have to score, and you're going to have to score in bunches, especially late in the game, as the Baltimore Ravens typically like to take early leads. That all being said, Chris Olave thus far this season has had himself 6 targets in the red zone that has led to 2 receiving touchdowns. Hopefully those numbers will continue to increase. He currently leads the team in that category, and hopefully those numbers trend in the right direction, can find himself more fantasy success. Moving on to Tyler Lockett, our number 16. This is one of the best matchups, and the last time Tyler Lockett was up against the Arizona Cardinals, I had him in my top 8 rankings. Unfortunately, put up a 2.7 fantasy point performance, but I do want to say I still got a lot of hope for him. I think top 12 is at a bare minimum in terms of overall upside. His base floor is probably number 16, but if he gets himself a touchdown, we're getting into the top 12 category, to say the very least, going into this week. Because recently, since 2020 against the Arizona Cardinals, his fantasy point contributions have been 17.2, 45.5, 24.5, 13.5. And of course, 2.7 earlier this year. That's a 20.68 fantasy point per game average against the Arizona Cardinals secondary. And the fact that, yes, he is coming off of a game in which he had himself a touchdown, 63 yards, 5 catches, unfortunately fumbled the ball on the 5-yard line. Also had a touchdown that was pretty much nullified because he dropped it. Also had another touchdown in which he stepped out of bounds. If in fact everything had gone in the direction of Tyler Lockett, the guy could have very easily had 4 touchdowns. I mean, at least 3 touchdowns on Sunday. So going forward, I think he's in a perfect position to succeed, especially against the division rival. Moving on to Terry McLaurin. Man, Terry McLaurin and DJ Moore. These are guys that were always in my mind as, man, they just need the right quarterback, the right situation, and it'll click. And right now, it seems like both of them are in said position. Taylor Heineke's really been getting the ball down the field towards Terry McLaurin, where he succeeds the most. And even though he took on Stephon Gilmore last week, he had himself another successful performance, 6 catches, 113. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, when Taylor Heineke's been under center, the average depth of target for Terry McLaurin has been 13.5 yards. If we're going to continue to send the ball down the field in his direction, obviously, he's worth every single penny of that new contract that he signed this offseason. And going up against the Minnesota Vikings defense, who got completely torched last week by DeAndre Hopkins and Rondale Moore, I think we're in another great position here for Terry McLaurin to continue his streak of 10-plus fantasy point games. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. Now, Michael Pittman Jr. had himself 9 targets, 7 catches, 53 yards. 8.8 half PPR fantasy points is relatively underwhelming, but when you take into account he played 95% of the snaps and garnered 39.13% of the target share within this offense, that gives you a different narrative. The fact that they take on the New England Patriots, and we've most recently seen Garrett Wilson go for over 100 against them. Amari Cooper, 44 and a touchdown. Allen Lazard go for over 100 against them. We have seen fantasy success against this secondary, and I believe if you want to go ahead and hold out Jonathan Taylor this week, which is possible considering he didn't practice today, we may be in a position where Sam Ehlinger is letting the ball rip, and if he's doing so, Michael Pittman is his number 1. Let's move on to our number 19 through 36 rankings, the second half of today's episode, giving you guys some visual representation first and foremost. Let me scoot over before I cut off Devin Duvernay here. As of this current moment in time, we have wide receivers like DK Metcalf here that maybe don't belong in this category in the second half of this conversation, but he's still a top 24 receiver in my mind. We'll talk about his struggles against Arizona and why I'm kind of leaning in this direction. Guys like Gabriel Davis, who are super touchdown dependent going forward, along with a guy like Allen Robinson. The questions in regards to whether or not Adam Thielen is going to be healthy this weekend. Is this his final week before TJ Hawkinson kind of garners a lot of that value? Is Darnell Mooney in the slot position going to get himself more utilization now that we have Chase Claypool pulling coverage across the field? These are all the questions we're going to be covering. Just wanted to give you guys a visual representation here. I think one of the most valuable prospects on this screen going into this week is, quite frankly, Josh Palmer. Because if, in fact, we do not see Keenan Allen play, Mike Williams is out, Josh Palmer could very easily go for a top 12 fantasy week against the Atlanta Falcons defense. So do not sleep on him. And don't think this number 26 rank is anything less than just his base minimum floor, even if Keenan Allen plays. All right, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and talk about our number 19, Tyler Boyd. Taking on the Carolina Panthers this week should not be something difficult for Tyler Boyd in this offense. Of course, they're going to get back to running the ball, and once they get back to running the ball, it's only going to open up more opportunity for receivers like Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins. Now, the number one thing that I wanted to mention is when I went ahead and did a little bit of research in regards to how well Tyler Boyd has specifically played in games in which Chase and or Higgins have been missing since 2021. These are the stats that I found. In those games, without Chase or Higgins, he's averaging 6.3 targets per game, 4.5 receptions per game, 60.3 receiving yards per game, and 0.67 touchdowns per game, which is a 12.28 fantasy point per game average. With Jamar Chase being out for probably 2 to 3 more weeks here, Tyler Boyd is a must-start player. And yes, he caught himself a lucky touchdown, but I don't think he'll be so lucky this week. I believe he's just going to be outplaying the secondary of the Carolina Panthers, who will be without Jerry McChin going into week 9. Moving on to Jakobi Meyers. Now, speaking of another guy that's been balling out most recently, Jakobi Meyers thus far this season is averaging 12.95 fantasy points per game. He has not put up less than 8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format this year, and is averaging 7.5 targets, 5.83 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and a half a touchdown per game. Obviously, with Mac Jones this last week, 12 targets, 9 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown. We are on a trend of just continuing to see Jakobi Meyers step up as a wide receiver 2, and in some circumstances, wide receiver 1, especially in full PPR scoring formats. Taking on the Indianapolis Colts, in my mind, isn't a difficult matchup, considering he plays in the slot position. If he was playing outside, we'd be a little bit worried. But going into this week, an automatic play as our number 20. Moving on to Gabriel Davis, our number 21. I wanted to first and foremost, obviously presented on screen that Gabriel Davis is in fact touchdown dependent. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is because even though you may be upset about his, relatively underwhelming performance last week, you have to understand that you go watch that game back. Gabriel Davis had an opportunity for a touchdown, but unfortunately didn't have both feet in the end zone. Would have been a 29-yard receiving touchdown, but it is the nature of the beast. And as of late, we had seen Gabriel Davis had himself, consecutive games of scoring touchdowns, and hopefully we're going to see him get back on track there, especially against the New York Jets. When we see Stefon Diggs pulling a lot of coverage from Sauce Gardner for majority of this game, we're going to see other receivers succeed. We've seen most recently guys like Myers go for 16.5 fantasy points last week against the Jets. Jerry Jeudy, 7 catches, 96. We saw Lazard go for 4 catches, 76 and a touchdown. There is potential, especially when opportunity is there, and knocking for Gabriel Davis. Moving on, we have Juju Smith-Schuster taking on the Tennessee Titans defense, which, quite frankly, is one of the easiest matchups of the position. When you have Cooks going for 4 and 73 last week, and then you had an incredible game from Paris Campbell, 10 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown. The Washington Commanders trio of wide receivers went for 13 receptions, 243, and 2 touchdowns. Mac Hollins went for 158 and 2 touchdowns. We had Stefon Diggs go for 148 and 3 touchdowns. They can't stop anybody. It is a given. And the fact that Juju Smith-Schuster is coming off of consecutive weeks of more than 5 catches, more than 5 targets, more than 100 receiving yards, having a minimum of 1 receiving touchdown in both those games, and over 19 fantasy points and a half PPR, the trend is just going to continue to build, and the chemistry between him and Patrick Mahomes is going in the right direction. And hopefully my offseason prediction of seeing him be in this conversation going forward isn't going to subside anytime soon. Moving on to our number 23, we have DeVonta Smith. Now, last week I was talking of DeVonta Smith saying, hey, listen, he has almost identical stats to A.J. Brown. And then A.J. Brown wanted to go ahead and come out and drop 3 receiving touchdowns and completely separate themselves from one another. That all being said, and that all being accomplished, DeVonta Smith still had himself 8 targets in that late game for 5 receptions. Now, unfortunately, average depth of target wasn't there. Only had himself 23 receiving yards and 4.8 fantasy points. But taking into account the fact that this was a blowout game and the target count was still available, I'm in the position to believe that DeVonta Smith is still going to be a successful option. And if a touchdown goes in his direction against Houston, it would not surprise me. Again, via PrizePicks going into Thursday night, if in fact you guys don't have anybody playing, you can go ahead and make an entry in regards to his overall reception count, picking more on 4.0 receptions. You might want to do that now before it moves up to 5.0, because according to the last 6 games that he has played, he's been able to go over 4 receptions in 5 out of those last 6 games. This is an entry that I'm automatically making going into Thursday night. Check out PrizePicks, use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. Moving on to DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf's a stud. We know this. It's no question at all. The only issue that I have with him is that even though he's the Terminator and he doesn't get injured, and the guy comes back after, a patella injury within literally 5 days, and then goes for a touchdown against, a secondary that wasn't playing bad all season long against the New York Giants. The issue that I have with him is that since 2021, he's only been averaging 5.93 fantasy points per game against the Arizona Cardinals. And the only good play that he's had since 2021 against the Arizona Cardinals is when he ran down Budda Baker. And I don't even know if that was in 21. I mean, to be honest, it could have been in 2020 for all I remember. But that's the only literal good play he's had against that secondary for years. And going forward, we're hoping for success, but it's not guaranteed, as they typically like to double cover and bracket him and eliminate him from the game. And that's why Tyler Lockett has himself such big performances against Arizona. Moving on to Curtis Samuel, who has been quite frequently getting himself more and more opportunity in the running game. His rushing stats over the last 2 weeks have been 26 rushing yards and 29 rushing yards. That in itself, in my opinion, the fact that his last name is Samuel, and we have Deebo Samuel, who used to run the ball last year a lot. Now we have Curtis Samuel running the ball a lot. It just continues to build more and more fantasy potential for him. Because yes, his target counts aren't there, but when you're getting yourself rushing opportunity, there could always be that end around jet sweep play within the 10-yard line that leads to a rushing touchdown. And when we have a matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who gave up 159 receiving yards and a touchdown to D-Hop, we saw Rondale Moore in the slot position go for 7 catches, 92 and a touchdown. Waddle in the slot position, 6 catches for 129. Of course, Tyreek Hill, 12 catches, 177. I think this is a fantastic position for Curtis Samuel to be in, as the momentum of the Washington Commanders are leading him into a pretty good matchup going into this week. Moving on. We have Joshua Palmer. Josh Palmer taking on the easiest matchup at the position. Like I mentioned earlier, when you give this man opportunity and you go ahead and put him in a situation where there may not be Keenan Allen, and we already know there's no Mike Williams, Josh Palmer could very easily blow right past this number 26 rank. Considering thus far this season, in any single game he's been given 7 or more targets, he's averaging 10 or more fantasy points and has been able to go over 10 fantasy points in every single one of those contests. Overall, again, it's a matter of what the health looks like of Keenan Allen. I'm telling you, if Keenan Allen's active, Josh Palmer could even be better than 26, just naturally because of the matchup. But if there's no Keenan, I probably have him in my top 15 rankings. I'm not even kidding. Moving on. We have our number 27. We have Christian Kirk. Now, I would love to see Christian Kirk get back into the top 15 rankings, but, as of late, really this offense has struggled. But luckily, they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. And the Las Vegas Raiders, thus far this season, have given up 2 touchdowns to every single quarterback they have played. And I don't think that trend is going to stop anytime soon. And with that being the case, we have an opportunity for Trevor Lawrence and this Jacksonville Jaguars offense to get back on track. And if they're going to do so, hopefully Christian Kirk will get himself the red zone targets that he highly dominated in early in this season, not only within this team, but within the National Football League. If in fact they get more utilization going in his direction via opportunities in terms of targets or rushing attempts, it doesn't matter. He's going to be a better play. Unfortunately, last week they took on Denver, the toughest matchup at the wide receiver position. But now we get a little bit of a flip of the script in a far more advantageous matchup against the Raiders. Moving on to Romeo Doubs. Now, Romeo Doubs is very similar to Josh Palmer in the idea that if in fact we do not see Allen Lazard suit up and play, his injury status probably, in my opinion, dictates the entire ranking and or utilization of Romeo Doubs for our lineups. You should play him if in fact there is no Allen Lazard in any sort of capacity, mainly because the Detroit Lions secondary has been awful all season long. But there may also be an argument that if in fact Allen Lazard is active and we end up seeing Jeff Okudah go onto his side and Romeo Doubs is playing against, Oruwariye, the secondary corner, we're in a position here where this secondary group for the Detroit Lions just fired their coach and they have to take on Aaron Rodgers, who's coming off of a 3-loss streak. We've recently seen Tyreek Hill go for 188 receiving yards, Waddle 106 and 2 touchdowns, Meyers 111 and a touchdown. Detroit's secondary is a joke. I'm expecting a lot from Romeo Doubs. Moving on, we have Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore had himself a lucky touchdown last week, but hey, I love lucky touchdowns. I would like to see one every single week, but the fact that he broke 3 tackles on a singular play because no one knows how to tackle on the Minnesota Vikings really isn't his fault. So I'll take the 7 receptions, 92 yards, and a touchdown. But I'm not expecting those incredible numbers once again. I'm expecting him to get a boatload of targets similar to the way that he was utilized earlier this season against the Seattle Seahawks defense, having himself 10 targets, 6 catches, 49 yards. And then last year in 2021, against his defense, 11 targets, 11 catches, 51 yards. High target volume, low average depth of target, pretty much is being carried by his reception total. If you're in a PPR, he's a better play. But in a half PPR, in the matchup, only averaging about 9.25 fantasy points per game in a half PPR, that's pretty much where I see him this week. Moving on to number 30, Adam Thielen. Going into this week, I have a little bit of a concern in regards to TJ Hawkinson maybe being implemented into the red zone formations and or offense. Because if you're going to implement a tight end within a short week to try to learn your entire offense, you might want to just solidify him to just playing in the red zone, similar to the way that, the 49ers did that with McCaffrey on a shorter week. But ultimately, if this is going to impact Adam Thielen, he may honestly be lower in rankings by the time we get to Sunday. But I don't know exactly how much utilization we're going to see out of TJ Hawkinson. Because if in fact, they're not going to implement him at a super fast rate and get him down into that red zone, we may see another Adam Thielen week here where he's very easily able to come away with a touchdown. And when he does so, we're going to be in a fantastic position for our fantasy teams. Moving on to Devin Duvernay, our number 31. Devin Duvernay, again, with Rashad Bateman out, most likely Mark Andrews out, maybe even Gus Edwards out, considering the fact that the Baltimore Ravens have a bye week in week 10, leads me to believe that Devin Duvernay, whether it's rushing, receiving, is going to get himself opportunity. They use him as a running back often, whether it's jet sweeps, whether it's handoffs just straight up under center, mainly because he's a return specialist. They're using him like Cordero Patterson's used in Atlanta, and I love to see it. Devin Duvernay's got a lot of value with all these other guys missing. Moving on to Allen Robinson. Again, he is very much so in the same boat as Gabriel Davis, but just doesn't have the deep receiving yardage potential as a Gabriel Davis. Though Allen Robinson's going to get himself touchdown opportunities. And yes, he is touchdown dependent and purely only gets, back shoulder fades within the red zone. But I'm okay with the idea of getting about 10 fantasy points under the assumption that he scores. His targets have been going up. His receptions are on a decent number. But if he can accommodate that performance with a touchdown, considering the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have lost the last 3 games against the LA Rams over the course of the last 3 seasons, I think we're in a good position here for Allen Robinson in a boat race to maybe find some potential in the end zone. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, number 33. Brandin Cooks put out a cryptic tweet, yesterday in regards to him almost being traded to the Cowboys. I don't know why they didn't just keep Amari Cooper if they needed a wide receiver. But as of this current moment in time, I don't even know if he's going to play because he didn't practice on Tuesday under the assumption that maybe he would be traded. Obviously, this is a short week going into the Thursday night game against the Eagles. He's obviously not happy about it because of what you guys, if you had seen the tweet, go check it out. I'm not 100% certain he even plays. But if he does, he's one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League. And when given an opportunity, he can find success. Let's move on to Garrett Wilson. It is a tough matchup. Nonetheless, I still think if this offense is going to have to throw the ball more and more because they're taking on the Buffalo Bills and the matchup is going to force them to pass because of the negative game script, Garrett Wilson could find himself a lot of success. My only concern is that Zach Wilson thus far this season has a 54.93% passing completion percentage. If those numbers are going to dip in any sort of capacity, similar to last season, I don't remember if you guys saw the game between the Buffalo Bills and the Jets last year, where Zach Wilson had a 35% passing completion percentage, 7 for 20 passing. I'm hoping those numbers don't repeat themselves, because if they do, Garrett Wilson could be in a little bit of trouble. Moving on to Drake London, number 35. I have Drake London here purely because I think there is a potential for him to have a big game, mainly because the LA Chargers secondary is terrible. There's no more J.C. Jackson, and maybe even J.C. Jackson would have helped him, but ultimately, this secondary is bad. And the defense as a whole is going to be struggling, whether it's stopping the run or through the air. So I think Drake London could have himself a sneaky, get right game here while everyone's benching him, similar to the same way that Kyle Pitts had it last week. But speaking of, while Kyle Pitts is pulling a lot of attention in his direction, so is Damiere Byrd, who scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. Maybe Drake London sneakily finds himself in the end zone. Moving on to our final wide receiver for today's episode, it is Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney will obviously have Chase Claypool in his lineup and probably contributing in some sort of capacity, but we're going to have to wait and see what the impact of that really entails in regards to Mooney's value. Because I still think that Darnell Mooney's value is a little bit capped because of the amount of opportunities this offense is getting in terms of the wide receiver position, because they're not throwing the ball much, and it's a run-first approach with, Justin Fields running the ball, 12 to 14 times a game over the last couple weeks here. And of course, Khalil Herbert, David Montgomery, both running the ball over 10 times per game, near the 15 range as well. If you're going to run the ball 45 times in a game, throwing the ball is not a priority, and that diminishes the value and or upside of Darnell Mooney, despite the fact that it is an advantageous matchup going into the week. All right, that's going to cover it for today. Again, if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. That would be greatly appreciated. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content, so if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow we have the Thursday night football game, so do not forget to go ahead and check out PrizePicks. Use promo code Andrew today by clicking on the link down below. And when you make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first deposit match up to $100. So check that out. Use promo code Andrew. Put in some entries in regards to maybe DeVonta Smith, more on overall receptions. We're talking about guys like Justin Jefferson going more on his receiving yard total. There's a lot of potential there. So check that out today. And until tomorrow, Thursday, I'll see you guys. Peace.